Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. My name is Chung-ke Chang, and I serve as Chief Strategy Officer at the Taiwan Biobank. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some reflections from our experience in building a stronger information security culture. The title of my talk is Fostering an Information Security First Culture, Insights from the Taiwan Biobank Experience. This is not a talk about products, tools, or technical architectures. Those matter, of course, but my focus today is on something more organizational, how security becomes part of how an institution thinks, decides, and operates. In our case, this question emerged in a setting that is highly sensitive, highly regulated, mission-driven, and deeply dependent on trust. That is what makes our experience interesting. But I also believe that many of the lessons that we learned extend beyond biobanks to other sectors that handle sensitive information and operate under law, accountability, and public expectations. So let me begin very briefly with who I am. My academic background is actually in the life sciences. I was trained in general biology. I completed a PhD in biological sciences and carried out postdoctoral research in biomedical sciences. So if you look only at the beginning of my career, you would probably think that I would not end up speaking at a cybersecurity event. But over time, my role evolved. At the Taiwan Biobank, as Chief Strategy Officer, I am also in practice the person carrying much of the responsibilities that traditional Chief Information Security Officer would carry in other organizations. Along the way, I also completed lead auditor training for ISO 27001 and ISO 27701. Now, I mention this because it reflects one of the themes of the talk. Information security is not always advanced only by people who started in IT or cybersecurity. In many organizations, especially mission-driven ones, security becomes a leadership and governance issue that requires people from different backgrounds to engage with it seriously. So today's talk will be structured around four main questions. First, why security culture matters, and then we will talk about why biobanks are uniquely challenging in this context. Third, we will tell you how we responded to these challenges at the Taiwan Biobank. And last but not least, what others may learn from this experience. The first half of the talk sets up the problem. The second half becomes more concrete and focuses on what we actually did, where we faced resistance, and what our experience taught us. So let's start with the question of what security really protects. When people hear the phrase information security, they often think first about systems, accounts, networks, or maybe data, especially the confidentiality of data. Those are, of course, very important, but they are only the first layer. What this slide tries to show is that in an environment like ours, a security issue does not only remain as a data issue, but it can also become a strategic issue. Now, the first thing that security protects is, of course, sensitive participant-related information. Now, that includes confidentiality and appropriate control over access. But if you look at the second domino in this slide, this is research continuity and data stewardship. Now, if information is mishandled, the consequences are not only technical, because research operations can be disrupted and the confidence in data stewardship can weaken. So the organization's ability to operate smoothly can be affected. From there, the impact extends into the third domino, which is participant, partner, and public trust. And once trust is affected, the final consequences become institutional. That leads us to the last domino, which is the legitimacy and long-term mission. So the point I want to make here is simple. In institutions like the Taiwan Biobank, security is not merely about protecting data in isolation. It is about preventing a technical issue from becoming an operational, relational, and ultimately strategic problem. So that brings us to the question of culture. Why does culture matter? Because policies, controls, and governance frameworks do not implement themselves. Security outcomes are shaped by how people interpret expectations, how they make trade-offs, and how they behave in ordinary daily work. This slide shows a chain: formal security on the left side and daily decisions in the middle, and either strong practice or weak practice at the end. The link between formal security and daily decisions is culture. In other words, culture is what turns formal security into everyday practice. An organization may have policies, controls, and governance on paper. But if the actual norms reward convenience over discipline, if accountability is vague, or if people work around procedures whenever pressure increases, then security remains largely symbolic. On the other hand, when culture is healthy, daily decisions are more likely to be disciplined, consistent, and resilient. This is why I do not view culture as a soft or secondary topic. Culture is the mechanism through which security either becomes real or remains paper compliance. Now let me briefly place the Taiwan Biobank in context. The Taiwan Biobank is a national-scale resource that supports biomedical research. It carries long-term stewardship responsibilities over sensitive participant data. It operates at the intersection of science, ethics, regulation, and trust, and it has to enable research while also protecting information and institutional integrity. That is what makes our setting distinctive. A biobank is not simply an IT environment with sensitive files, nor is it simply a research program. It is actually an organization that has to preserve value over time while remaining trustworthy, accountable, and operationally credible. That is why information security in this setting is so consequential. Security is tied not only to systems and compliance, but to stewardship and legitimacy. Now, what makes biobanks uniquely challenging is that they operate under a dual mandate. On one side, they have to enable research. That means scientific access, ways to collaborate, discovery, and you have to think about the public benefit. On the other side, they must also protect trust. That means protecting sensitive data, meeting legal and ethical duties, preserving accountability, and sustaining continuity. The challenge is not to choose one of these sides. It is to govern both at the same time. This is actually a very important point. Security in a biobank cannot simply mean locking everything down. If you do that, you actually undermine the main mission of a biobank. But if you focus only on enabling use and access without adequate governance and controls, then you undermine trust, legality, and long-term viability. So the challenge is not simply stronger control or greater openness. The challenge is disciplined governance of both. Now, this dual mandate is not managed in an open field. It exists within legal and regulatory boundaries. In Taiwan, I would summarize those boundaries as 3 legal layers. First, in the green box, we have the Human Biobank Management Act, which provides the biobank-specific legal foundation. It governs biobank governance, how consent is given and approved, oversight, and the use and transfer controls. As an example, in Taiwan, the transfer of genetic data is very tightly controlled, to the point that under normal circumstances, the genetic data cannot be sent abroad. Second, in the blue box, we have the Personal Data Protection Act, which governs the handling of sensitive personal data. This brings in issues of purpose limitation, privacy safeguards, and the rights of these participants. The gray box is the Cybersecurity Management Act, which actually adds the formal cybersecurity governance layer. So these include things like security controls, compliance expectations, incident reporting, and oversight over the incident. So the main point of this slide is that law defines the boundary for access, use, protection, and accountability. Security in this setting is therefore not only a technical choice, but it is a legal operating requirement. Now, once law enters the picture, culture actually becomes even more important. These slides make that point through a simple matrix. If regulatory is high and cultural maturity is weak, so that is on the left upper side, the organization moves towards the highest risk quadrant. You have inconsistent decisions, delayed escalation, and paper compliance. Now, if your cultural maturity is stronger, then even under high regulatory pressure, the organization is in a much stronger position. You could have disciplined practice, reliable escalation, and accountable operation. The key message here is that law does not reduce the need for culture. It actually amplifies it. Because rules do not interpret themselves and policies do not apply themselves, you still need people to make judgments, raise concerns, handle ambiguity, and behave consistently under pressure. In regulated environments, such as ours, weak culture becomes more consequential because the effects are not only operational, they can also become legal, governance, and institutional problems. Imagine a scenario where there is a security issue that was raised and it was just overlooked by everybody else. Under this scenario, if it becomes public knowledge that some data has leaked out, then you often will see that on newspapers, and the entire public will know that something bad happened at your organization. Under these circumstances, you would lose public trust. Hence, this is why the legal part actually makes culture even more important. Now let me shift to the second half of the talk and focus on what we actually did. So to understand our response, it is useful to start with our historical background in cybersecurity. Since the inception of the Taiwan Biobank in 2012, we already had documented standard operating procedures for security and privacy at the time. So this is not a story of starting from nothing. But over time, those documented practices evolved into a more formal and more visible system. So this timeline shows that progression. In 2012, the foundation was just the standard operating procedures and some baseline awareness. We knew that cybersecurity and privacy was important. But this was not formalized until 2015 with the introduction of the BS 112 standard. This is a privacy management standard, and it helped us become more structured and deliberate. Then 1 year later, ISO 27001 made security expectations more formal and visible, strengthening our accountability. And then 5 years later, in 2021, ISO 27701 helped integrate our security and privacy more consistently. Now, what matters here is not the certification as a badge. What matters is what formalization did to our organization. So at the early stage, we created awareness. But this was like a fuzzy idea floating in our minds. We knew it was important, but we had not really formalized it. Then we made privacy more structured. But privacy alone was not enough. And so when expectations became more visible and people clamored for more accountability, we started to integrate cybersecurity and privacy together into how our organization operated. So this slide is really about our maturation. It is about how documented practice gradually contributed to a more security-conscious culture. Now, once formalization increased, the next question was responsibility. Because certification by itself does not protect anything. What matters is whether responsibility becomes clear across these institutions. At the Taiwan Biobank, one important shift was that security stopped being seen only as the job of IT. So the management had to endorse security as an organizational priority and support certification and follow through. The information security and IT functions had to build and maintain the management system and drive control implementation and audits. Our operations also had to accommodate by applying standard operating procedures in daily workflows and handle participant-related data responsibly. And the entire staff had to broadly understand the general expectations, report issues, and practice secure behavior. This mattered because then we started to have a real culture that allow people to know what is expected of them. One of the biggest advances that we made was organizational, not merely technical. Security became real in practice when it stopped being seen as IT's job alone. So what changed in daily practice? Some people say that culture becomes visible when routine work changes. And this is what this slide is about. Let's start with access handling. Previously, our access handling has been more of an ad hoc type and person dependent because we did not really keep very good records of how or who actually handled a certain type of data. Now, since our certification, this became more clearly governed through approval and review. A second shift involved the use of procedures. Although our standard operating procedures had existed before, they sometimes remain as background documents. And over time, they sort of drifted. And sometimes they even were disjointed from how the field actually worked. So over time, by rectifying this situation, these standard operating procedures became more consistently tied to daily work. A third shift was in incident reporting. Before, there could be uncertainty about when to report, what to report, and who to report to. We worked toward clearer procedures so that escalation became more actionable. A fourth shift involved exception handling. So sometimes our people in the past tended to allow convenience to produce informal workarounds, and exceptions were kind of the norm. But nowadays, exceptions are treated more deliberately and more visibly. Now, these are operational details, but this is where culture lives, because culture becomes visible not in slogans, but in routine behaviors, repeated decisions, and what people do when process becomes inconvenient. Of course, none of this happened without resistance. Security culture grows through friction, not in the absence of it. The first form of resistance was ownership resistance. For example, some non-IT colleagues felt that security was IT's job, not theirs. Our response was to extend the ISO 27001 and 27701 training to non-IT personnel and to repeat consistently the message that security is a shared responsibility. The second form of resistance was operational friction. Some procedures clearly made work less convenient. We do not deny that. In some cases, we just accepted that some friction was necessary. This, of course, took some talking and communication between different groups in our organization. But in other cases, we waited for regulatory expectations to become clearer. Of course, we use our audits as a way to reinforce the legitimacy of our requirements. The third form of resistance was the workload. Compliance, unfortunately, often requires supporting systems and more work from our colleagues. So our response was pragmatic. If we had an existing system that was working, then we would use that instead of trying to come up with a new system. And if we really needed a new system, we would do that selectively, and we try to avoid as much unnecessary duplication as possible. For example, we have two standards. So the two standards, they share some of the standard operating procedures. So instead of maintaining two documents, we can get away with maintaining just one. So the lesson here is not that we eliminated the friction, but it is that we try to make friction more understandable, more legitimate, and more manageable. So looking back, there are several lessons I would highlight from this experience. The first is that legitimate access is the problem. In many conventional security discussions, the focus is on blocking unauthorized access. In a biobank, the harder problem is often governing authorized use responsibly. Second, security is a long-term stewardship. So any decision we make about access, protection, and governance needs to hold up over years, not just for today. Third, trust is part of the operating model. Without trust, participation, legitimacy, and continuity weaken, and resilience declines. Last but not least, regulation increases the need for judgment. Law may define the boundaries, but people still need to apply those boundaries in real situations. So let me end my talk with one final thought. Information security is governance over time, under trust, and within the law. You have to have all three in order to establish a resilient information security culture. So a security-first culture is how that governance becomes real in daily practice. For us at the Taiwan Biobank, that has a specific meaning because it means that security is not only about technical controls. In our case, it is about long-term stewardship, responsible access, organizational discipline, and the ability to operate credibly in a trust-dependent and regulated environment. However, I do believe that the same logic extends beyond biobanks. Any organization that handles sensitive information depends on trust or operates under significant legal and regulatory obligations. So they often face a similar underlying challenge. The challenge is not simply to install controls. It is to govern behavior over time, preserve trust while carrying out the mission, and make formal obligations real in daily work. With that, I would thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope that our experience has contributed in some small way to your own thinking about what it really takes to build a security-first culture. Thank you all, and goodbye.